An ancient and nomadic race, the ones known as the Tusken Raiders, or just simply as the Sand People, are a group of mysterious tribal beings known for their hostility towards outsiders, as well as their honor-bound traditions. The Tusken history is one cloaked in shadow, as their severe isolationism and xenophobia prevents most galactic historians from risking their lives in order to find these stories. Each tribe has a Tusken who is known as the Storyteller, a highly revered member of the tribe who is raised from birth to record and retell their entire history through memory only. On the extremely rare occasion that an outsider earns the respect of the tribe, the storyteller might divulge the history of his or her race, albeit very reluctantly. Since the Tuskens record their history through memory and oral communication only, some would consider their history to be inaccurate or with a huge tilt and bias. The Tuskens themselves believe their rendition of the past nigh infallible in its exactness, and to write such coveted history on the fibers of such weak and earthly material would render it all the more vulnerable to those who would wish to sabotage their telling of antiquity. The Tusken Raiders have a perplexing history, and take root from a race that paradoxes their current state of being almost entirely. In order to better understand their modern disposition, we must go all the way back to the era aptly named Before the Republic, an era that existed almost 27,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. In this faraway time, there were no beings known as the Tusken Raiders, and Tatooine was a lush jungle paradise that allowed its native inhabitants to rapidly develop their technology and space travel far faster than the majority of the other races in the galaxy. This race of highly developed sentience was known as the Kamamga, and they were one of the first to reach the stars and explore their neighboring moons. Unfortunately for the Kamamga, and regardless of their impressive advancements, they were still greatly overshadowed by a much more powerful and malicious of beings. A dire realization they were faced with after attracting the attention of the Infinite Empire. Swiftly and mercilessly overtaking the planet, the Rakata enslaved the Kamamga, forcing them into hard labor and butchering them without remorse. For years, the Kamamga lay beneath the heel of their Rakatan overlords, their pride and independence as a race totally rendered to pieces. It is here where the events of history begin to blur. We know that the Kamamga miraculously began to resist the Rakata in a massive uprising, but exactly how is not really known. The Kamamga posed such a threat that the Infinite Empire was eventually forced from the planet, so this would lead most to believe that they were severely weakened in some fashion. Maybe they were preoccupied with different conflicts, and were lacking the resources needed to combat the Kamamga. Perhaps it was this point in time that the Rakata became afflicted by the disease that would cause their eventual downfall. Either way, the Kamamga drove out the Rakata, but they would find that true victory was far from their grasp. Pulling their forces out of Tatooine, the Rakata, in a final act of revenge, loomed over the planet and set forth their weapons of mass destruction. As the Infinite Empire's vengeance rained upon the planet, the hellish fires of the weapons reforged the jungle world. The lush soil fused within its silica base, and all plant life was torched instantly in a flash of catastrophic light. Through the fiery deaths of countless numbers of Kamamga, Tatooine was born anew into a desolate and unforgiving world, a mocking paradox of its former glory. Though millions of Kamamga perished in the cataclysm, a fraction of them managed to seek shelter. Massive cavernways served as sanctuaries, and the Kamamga remained there for thousands of years before ever attempting to set foot on the surface. What really took place within those dark and rocky havens is totally unknown, but when the survivors emerged and saw the light once again, they were not as they once were. Transformed in consequence to the ruthless environment and the unyielding culture it forced them to adopt, the descendants of the survivors of old did not rise as Kamamga, but as the very first Tusken Raiders. Roaming amidst the newly born sand of Tatooine, the Tusken Raiders were then truly forced to come to terms with their new identity and the desolate landscape. Eventually, it was realized that others among the Kamamga had taken refuge within other sanctuaries, and like the Tuskens, they were forever transformed. This race was none other than the Jawas. Through their biological and cultural evolution, the Jawas were in almost a direct contrast to their former kin. There would be no reunification. The differences were just too jarring for either race. For several millennia, Tatooine remained a forgotten and uninhabited world by any of those other than the natives. During this era of obscurity, the Tuskens ventured out amidst the sandy wastelands, splitting into several tribes and tempering their new identity through the trials of survival. Though they enjoyed isolation for several thousands of years, the arrival of the Zerka Corporation would force them to put their newfound hardness to the test. As the Zerka Corporation attempted to displace the native Tuskens and turn the planet into a mining world, settlers began to establish small towns and marketplaces in order to capitalize on this new opportunity, only further straining Tatooine's already scarce resources. It was from this very first conflict between settlers and the Sand People that the colloquial name was given, as one of the earliest of the raids took place within a settlement known as Fort Tusken. After several bloody conflicts, the bulk of Zerka Corporation and their forces were gradually pushed back, but the seeds of eternal conflict were already planted. The settlers and the Tusken people would be in a perpetual conflict within the remainder of known history. Unfortunately for the Tusken people, this would be a recurring theme across the remainder of their society. With a vast supply of minerals within the planet's core, and its far distance from more of the civilized parts of the galaxy, crime lords would often set their strongholds upon Tatooine, only further angering the Tuskens' rage. The most notorious of crime syndicates was the ever-present and absolutely ruthless Hutt cartel. Having funded the continued growth of Tatooine's slave market, and eventually, along with the Magister Hugo Damask, a wildly popular pod racing tournament was established, and the Hutt's foothold upon the planet was only growing with each passing day, and that growth was largely watered with the blood of the planet's indigenous races. Though the Hutts became the overlords of Tatooine, they had not stood unopposed. While it is easy for us to view the Tusken people as bloodthirsty warmongers, it must be remembered that the Sand People and the foreign rulers of Tatooine are inherently and perpetually set within conflict of one another, and we scarcely ever hear of the atrocities truly set against the Tuskens due to their lack of control over the planet, as well as their nomadic lifestyle. It must also be remembered that the Sand People are not one large centralized society, but rather countless coalitions of tribes with their own varying codes of honor and degrees of tolerance. One of the most notable and honorable Tusken leaders was a man known as Shared Het, a man who was actually a human and former Jedi. While I could tell you the expansive narrative of Shared Het and his people, and the political climate of this time, I would honestly be doing you a great disservice. Instead, I have to point you to an excellent chronicle of Shared's life history, and one of my personal favorite Star Wars retellings ever. Grey Jedi 91's character profile will fill in this essential part of Tusken history for you, and give new insight to the part it played in galactic history. While the Tusken Raiders have been locked into conflict with settlers and crime lords for the remainder of their known history, their millennial-old resilience is testament to their unbreakable will. While they themselves have not played a pivotal role in the shaping of the galaxy's most well-known events, their unending tenacity and ancient resolve is known to all. It is obvious that the Tusken Raiders' existence will only cease along with that of the planet of Tatooine itself. Due to their shrouds and garbs, it is not actually known what a Tusken Raider looks like. All that is discernible is that they are biped and humanoid in their physiology. The human Tusken, known as Shared Het, claims that humans and racial Tuskens are incompatible reproductively, which tells us that Tuskens are vastly different from us on a genetic level, despite their similar body structure at a first glance. Their harsh and guttural language, known as Tusken, also leads me to believe that their vocal system is dissimilar to our own, though this is total speculation on my part. It also seems rational for me to assume that the Tusken people are heavily adapted to Tatooine's fierce climate. They have spent countless millennia within this world, and have persevered. Clearly, survival of the fittest has been the rule of their way of life, and I believe this almost certainly continues to play a massive part in the shaping of Tusken biology. As stated earlier, Tusken Raiders do not live in a centralized society, but rather countless fragmented tribes with their own views and methods of survival. But regardless, there are still many unifying qualities and cultural characteristics that these tribes all share. Firstly, Tusken Raiders speak the Tusken language, which is a very disjointed and shrieking sounding language that continues to baffle galactic linguists. While there have been language protocol droids made to translate and speak it, it truly takes an expert for a sentient to converse with these nomadic beings, unassisted. I've mentioned previously that the Tuskens refuse to write down their history. To break away from this tradition in an act of blasphemy would be even difficult past the threats of death upon being discovered. The Tusken language does not have a written system, and as such they rely solely on spoken word and material reminders. Their manner of clothing is just as rigid, and although this clothing serves a pious purpose, it is also very utilitarian. They wear long robes that cover every inch of their skin, and their face is fitted with a respirator to funnel out sand from the air. Around their neck is a humidifier tank, which moves moisturized air into their mask to keep their lungs healthy from the harsh climate. In most Tusken tribes, it is unheard of to remove one's garbs in the presence of others, unless they are within the privacy of their own tents, or on their wedding day or coming of age. Regarding their coming of age, it is here would most find the most detestable quality for this race. The coming of age is a ritual of great importance to the Tuskens. In some tribes, this ritual entails the capturing of a formidable animal, which is tortured and bled brutally through the course of several weeks. In these sorts of tribes, even greater prestige is given to those who manage to capture a sentient, and it was likely this sort of ritual had led to the capture and brutal torture of Shmi Skywalker. In other tribes, the coming of age is more related to the actual hunt, and the greatest beast possible is to be killed. Within Ashrad's case, he was to kill a giant crate dragon, and bring its pearl from the beast's stomach to his tribe as an offering. It seems this version of the coming of age ritual holds more respect for the hunt itself, and gives the animal a relatively quick death compared to the horrific tortures other Tusken tribes sometimes partake in. When these rituals would take a more violent and detestable of routes, the Tuskens would not always go unpunished. After the killing of Shmi Skywalker, and the subsequent slaughter of the tribe by an enraged Anakin Skywalker, Tuskens who had come to discover this carnage would be so horrified by what they had found, they had believed Anakin was something of a desert demon, and added him to their mythos as an angry god. Tribes would often come to the location of the slaughter and leave sacrifices in hopes to keep the spirit away. It was these sorts of conflicts between Tusken and settler, as well as the scarcity of resources, that often caused bloodshed. Being a largely nomadic race, the Tuskens rely on raiding their more sedentary neighbors for what they need almost exclusively, as their name implies. While some Tusken Raiders will cut a swath across the lands and pillage all that they can find, there are many other tribes who raid only when absolutely necessary, and take only what is needed for survival. As you can probably imagine, this means they are equipped with an array of weaponry. As the men of the tribes are expected to be the foragers, hunters, and warriors, the Sand people have a special connection with their weapons and mounts. It is believed that the connection between the Bantha and the Tusken Raider is of great spiritual importance, and the art of taming one of these large desert creatures is something of a rite of passage in itself. Strangely, even the most bloodthirsty of Tusken Raiders show an affection and reverence for these animals, and it is considered a sorrowful event to the tribe when a Bantha dies. Oftentimes, when a rider is killed but the Bantha is left living, the beast will fall into an inescapable melancholy, and oftentimes will refuse to eat or drink, surrendering itself to a death in sorrow. Preferring to initially engage their opponents at a distance if possible, Tusken Raiders will often position themselves amidst rocky outcrops and attempt to snipe their enemies. Their ranged weapon of choice is usually the Tusken Cycler Rifle, which is a weapon believed to have been a precursor to the Zerka 6.2 AUG-2 hunting rifle, long ago looted by the Sand people as the corporation first began operations. Unlike a typical blaster rifle, the Tusken Cycler is actually a slug thrower, and fires a solid round encased by an energy shell. While often scoffed at for being considered something of a backwater weapon, the Cycler rifles are exceptionally easy to maintain, extremely durable, and compatible with the most ragtag of modifications, making it something of a boon in the hands of the Sand people. Their melee weapon of choice is the Gothy stick, and holds a pious and cultural use as well as an offensive one. The Gothy stick was usually fashioned either from ransacked metal from vehicles, such as shuttles or speeders, or sometimes slag from crudely refined resources. Each is custom made by the wielder. They all do feature a flanged mace on one end, with a spear-like point on the other. The intricacies of each weapon are so specific to each wielder, the Tuskens can decipher much about the Gothy's wielder simply by the design of their weapon. However, an injury that would disable a Tusken's ability to wield a Gothy stick would lead to an ultimate disgrace amidst the tribe, and then force the Tusken Raider into exile. Such is the profoundness of the weapon within their culture. Asherad Het would be one victim to exile for this reason, after having lost his arm in a duel with Obi-Wan Kenobi. As I had talked about earlier, it is no secret that Tusken Raiders have a very volatile relationship with other sentients on Tatooine, and distrust and xenophobia are typically embedded characteristics within the culture of the Sand People. Eternally tied to their land, racial Sand People are found exclusively on Tatooine, and there have not been any records of them outside of their homeworld for any reason whatsoever. As you probably are already aware, Tusken Raiders are an extremely xenophobic race, seeing any sentient as an outsider, and someone to be pushed out from Tatooine. Even their racial cousins and neighbors, such as the Jawas, rarely receive mercy from the Tuskens' anger. Oftentimes, Tusken Raiders can be seen trying to disrupt outsider activity in any way possible, and it is very common for Sand People to take aim at pod racers, for both spite and sport. Despite all this, and as mentioned earlier, not all Tusken Raiders are Sand People racially. Both Sharad Het and his son Asherad Het were humans. Sharad Het ran into a Tusken tribe during his self-exile, and subsequently earned the respect of the group, eventually ascending himself as a war leader. While this is definitely an unusual event for someone who is not a racial Tusken Raider, it does show that in some instances, showings of power and dedication can trump the Sand People's natural distrust of outsiders. Aside from seeing the other races as a threat to their way of life, the Tusken Raiders also cite their close spiritual connection with the land of Tatooine, believing that they themselves are an extension of it. Therefore, any outsiders are seen as an unworthy blemish upon the planet, and something to be repelled. Their belief in this idea is so strong that they also refuse to ride upon any vehicles, believing that only sacred animals are permissible to be used for travel, if not simply moving by way of foot. All in all, the Tusken Raiders are a race of sentients forged from both tragedy and bloodshed. They are eternally tied to their land, and have shown that they will continue to exist for as long as the planet Tatooine itself. Some notable Tuskens include the Storyteller, as translated by HK-47, the noble exile Sharad Het, and the Sith who would later abolish the rule of two, Darth Krayt.